Welcome to the Gestalt Get Together, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. Each episode has its own accompanying audio course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. The Gestalt Get Together is your podcast for discussing the state of the evidence of Gestalt Language Processing, associated therapy modalities, and how our field is responding to the frameworks of GLP and NLA. I'm Corinne Zmoos, MS, CCC-SLP, a musical language therapist who's dedicated to celebrating while investigating Gestalt language processing, protecting the scientific method, and reducing cognitive linguistic biases about this framework and these clients that I love so much. My areas of focus are psychoacoustics, music theory, and musical syntax in GLPs. Previously, I worked closely with key players in the GLP quote-unquote movement, but experienced concerns with the propensity for logical fallacies and resistance to quantitative inquiry in the larger community. I now identify myself as lovingly skeptical, and I hope that listeners will sharpen their ability to recognize linguistic choices that move a cause forward without strong evidence, what level of evidence we're actually dealing with, and where we need to go next to support these kids that we care about. So what can you expect from us? Our episodes will provide balanced and educational interviews about clinician experiences, live coaching and problem solving about therapeutic decision making with a healthy dose of musical language recommendations thrown in, discussions on the logical fallacies and cognitive biases that emerge when implementing a new approach, and even some elements of the BITE model that have emerged within the larger GLP movement. Most importantly, this podcast is intended to help you embrace, investigate, and analyze your unique role in child development for Gestalt language processors without getting in your own way. This podcast is a celebration of neurodivergent learning, and we look forward to you learning with us along the way. Hello, and welcome to the Gestalt Get Together. This is your podcast for discussing the state of the evidence of Gestalt language processing, associated therapy modalities, and how our field is responding to the growing ecosystem around GLP discourse. My name is Corinne Zmoos, and I aim to investigate psychoacoustics, music theory, and musical syntax in GLPs in my own work. I love Gestalt language processors, and I work with them every day. I've had massive success using ideas from proposed frameworks like natural language acquisition, but I also identify as lovingly skeptical because I want more information, I want more data, and I want more evidence. My hope is that listeners of this podcast will sharpen their ability to recognize things like linguistic choices that can move a cause forward, advocate for stronger evidence, as well as balance the three sides of the EBP triangle. Here on this podcast, I aim to provide balanced and educational interviews about clinician experiences, live coaching and problem solving, discussions on things like logical fallacies and cognitive biases, and what is going on in these online and social media movements that then disperse outwards to our clinical settings. So this evening, we're going to be talking about logical fallacies, and this is going to be part 2 of logical fallacies. So I definitely recommend listening to part 1 because that's going to help set the stage with some of the more common logical fallacies. But if you're just joining for this episode, don't worry, we are going to do an overview of what these fallacies are, give you a couple of examples, and share some composite examples of instances where these come about. In these episodes, I do stay away from using direct quotes from those who've posted them. I create kind of composites, statements in my own words that speak to things that I've seen, because I don't find it fair or helpful to pull direct quotes from individuals who are truly trying their best to share information about something that they love and believe in. And so, once again, this episode is called Logical Fallacies in Clinical Decision-Making for Gestalt Language Processors, Part 2. Now, the goal of this podcast, and if you're here for the webinar, is to explain logical fallacies and how they tend to permeate the consumption of Gestalt language processing claims and discourse. And we could really say this for a lot of subfields or niches in this world. I know I've heard from people who are interested in myofunctional therapy that they also see logical fallacies in that kind of social media ecosystem. And so it's not just those who are interested in GLP. Now, I hope that you leave this episode with a foundational understanding of at least 3 to 5 logical fallacies. I want you to start to be able to explain where and why these might emerge. Start to recognize them in your own decision making, and maybe start to make a plan about how you'll start to interrogate certain claims that come up, particularly in social media platforms. Now, let's go over again. What are logical fallacies? I want to set this foundation again. Logical fallacies are language techniques or language choices that a communicator makes. Think about someone sharing a really cute post on Instagram, someone sharing information in a Facebook group or in a tweet. These are language choices or decisions and techniques that weaken their claim. If they're making a claim about something, what follows that actually weakens the claim. It doesn't provide a strong argument. This may be something like a misapplied belief of theirs. It might be a misinformed idea that they have. Perhaps an argument that isn't quite there. It's inadequate. It needs more. It can also be a really illogical argument or completely invalid. And then there can be instances of fallacy where there's actually deception involved. And these are persuasion-driven language. I know this comes up a lot when we think about politics. Political language can sometimes be very deceptive and about persuasion rather than sharing facts and evidence that could move a cause forward, like when we're working with clients and we want to pass on strong information to be the best clinicians we can be. And I do want to speak to how persuasion is not always a bad thing. And also sometimes people who are making claims or trying to communicate, they don't even realize that they're engaging these or they're engaging in something that we can consider deception. I always like to assume that people who are in clinical spaces and sharing about their work are engaging in good faith claims and good faith arguments. I like to start from there and then assess rather than the other way around. So why might it matter to know what logical fallacies are and start to see if they're coming up in different places? So in terms of clinical and scientific information, especially on social media, we are the ones as consumers who actually have to do the difficult and challenging investigatory work. And typically in other settings like major news outlets, that fact checking is done by people who might have a full-time job doing that. And so it's up to us to do that work. And most people don't have the time, they don't have the bandwidth, or they may not have, again, time and bandwidth to look into that information and learn what they need to interrogate that claim someone's making. But if we start to know the names of fallacies, you may start to notice them, and that is a great place to start. And hopefully, I want you to start to notice why someone's argument doesn't actually, when we're looking back to the claim, fully prove their claim, even if you can't quite explain why, just starting to notice where it comes up. I also just want to touch again on the fact that we're talking about social media here. It also might be a quick conversation in the hallway with a colleague of yours. It may be a text, like a group text you have with other clinicians or researchers. These interactions can be really brief, and brevity can be really compelling. It feels really good to get a little soundbite or a little chunk of information that could make our sessions easier and make us better clinicians. And also in online spaces, I mean, comment sections are a zoo. There's sometimes little room for detailed argumentation and maybe little tolerance or even some pugnacious interactions. I've seen some pretty tense interactions happen on posts related to GLP. And so what I think happens is that we're combining this desire to help others. I haven't met an SLP yet who doesn't want to help people. But also on social media, there's that thrill and that dopamine hit of getting followers, getting likes, and I'm speaking from personal experience, that when I post something about GLP, music theory, psychoacoustics, and it gets a lot of traction and interest, no matter how much I fight it, it's really reinforcing. And it might make it harder for me to look back and think, oh, did I use a logical fallacy there? Was I not making a good argument and perhaps trying to persuade more than to share information? And a lot of social media communicators, they understand what works. Things are eye-catching, they're pretty, they're simple, and putting a lot of citations, putting really clear long-form arguments and evidence, not a lot of people are going to stick around and read that. And a lot of these choices are made in good faith. People see others make really cute posts that are visually engaging, really nice carousels or stories, and they get a lot of attention. And we in a social media ecosystem think, oh, well, that's what everyone's doing. I'll do that too. Now, the final slide about this that I want to share about is that I think it's of critical importance that just because something has a logical fallacy, it doesn't mean that the person's claim is necessarily wrong. Someone making a claim that has weakness in it, or the argument doesn't fully relate to the claim, or it's appealing to emotion, or it's appealing to values, it's appealing to fear. Those are weaknesses. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the original thing that they're saying is not true. It also doesn't necessarily make them deceptive. It doesn't necessarily make them a bad clinician or researcher. And I want to make that so clear. The use of logical fallacies is that we're human. And a lot of people who are making these logical fallacies are trying their best. Now, when we think about politicians, maybe not so much. But a logical fallacy can simply mean that there's not enough information provided, not enough evidence, no citations, or the quality of the evidence is low. It's a really old study and your argument is not including more updated research. And also when I've talked to people about biases that come up in their communication, as well as when I'm interrogating my own, my cognitive biases are intruding on my ability to interpret facts to support my arguments. I think another important thing to note, which I noted in part 1 of this logical fallacy series, is that I am guilty of these every day. I think that a listener or a watcher of this webinar might think, who are you to perhaps think that you're better than everyone else without logical fallacies? I want to make it very clear I engage in these every single day. It's really hard to get away from these when we're trying to educate parents, educate other clinicians, perhaps educate clients about the care we want to provide, when we don't have time to explain all of the rationale behind what we do. And so just kind of shining a light on that, I do this every day. I'm learning more and more about fallacies every day, and I'm really trying to make a concerted effort to, once again, interrogate this in my own work. And the other thing is that this episode and this presentation will probably be rife with logical fallacies as well. If you notice one, let me know. The first one I want to share about is called the appeal to nature fallacy. So what is the appeal to nature fallacy? This fallacy occurs when someone makes a claim that something that is perceived as natural is good and correct. Oh, this thing is natural. It must be right. That's natural. It must be true. But then on the other side of the nature fallacy is that something that's unnatural is incorrect. It must be. Something that's unnatural is bad or wrong. Now, you might think about this first in a very different context than speech-language pathology. I want you to think about medicine or different compounds or chemicals. Arsenic is natural, but I certainly do not want arsenic in any part of my life. And I know that there's a little bit in some of the foods I eat. But ibuprofen is unnatural, but I really want to use that when I'm suffering and I want to mitigate my pain. It's just not as simple as natural versus unnatural. Now, I want to share what I'm going to call, again, these composite quotes that, again, are not drawing from direct quotes from everyone, because I do want to respect that many individuals are doing their best to communicate these ideas. And I don't feel comfortable doing any personal callouts. And you may have an issue with that because I'm not providing clear citations. I completely understand that side of it as well. So here's a composite of several quotes that I've seen in my own words. Quote, well, not really quote. Gestalt language acquisition is a natural process and should be honored. Working on single words is not natural for early stage GLPs. Another one that might speak to naturalness or nature might be on a different side of the spectrum of where we should work when it comes to language acquisition. And this might be someone saying, universal grammar is a natural component of human neurology. We should be working on the building blocks of grammar, not melodic phrases or lyrics. So we kind of have two different possible claims that are speaking in different directions. Whether we should be not working on single words because Gestalt language acquisition is a natural process. The gestalts are natural. We shouldn't be working on single words. But the other side of it, and universal grammar, if you're not familiar with that, I recommend looking into it, is sharing that we have this inner system for complex language and grammar in a very simple explanation of universal grammar. And so because of that, we should be working on the building blocks of grammar because our brains are primed for it. They're ready for it. So the first issue that can exist with the appeal to nature fallacy is that it can be kind of hard to define what natural is, especially dependent on context. Natural in the world of pharmacology versus anthropology versus speech-language pathology versus political science versus economics. How do we all define natural? Now, something really interesting that I do see quite often in GLP discourse or those who are in opposition to all of the emerging ideas and frameworks around GLP is that sometimes claims with the appeal to nature argue their points with contradictions. So it's really interesting to see where the contradictions can come up with the appeal to nature. So here are two hypothetical claims you might see. Number one, language happens naturally. We just need to provide the right supports. And it sounds so lovely. And this is something I used to say something like this very often before I started to really think about how I was communicating about Gestalt processing and wanting to be clearer and get better evidence for my claims. I would say things like language happens naturally, just need to provide the right supports. And again, just because there's a fallacy here, it doesn't mean it's not true. But when we think about natural, this claim kind of posits that language acquisition happens naturally. But then it also says right after that the supports, which are changes in communication partner behavior and changes in the environment, make that possible. So it happens naturally, but when we provide the right supports, it happens naturally. So is it natural if we're changing our behavior or changing the environment? You might argue that there's some contradiction there. Now, if we think about someone who might come from like the other side, and there is no black or white here, there is a range of opinions on GLP and everything related to it versus verbal behavior, all of that. And I don't want to engage in black or white either or, because that is another fallacy actually. But someone who might be, quote, on the other side may say, echolalia is a phenomena for most young children acquiring language in some way, but real language is composed of words and uses syntax. Echolalia in autism is a repetitive restricted behavior, and it may prevent true language from occurring. So they're saying that echolalia is a natural part of a lot of children acquiring language, but when it applies to autistic children, it's not actually a part of real language. So this is another example of, are there contradictions within that? And that's something I'd want to know more about and get more evidence from the person making that claim. Especially, and I've seen this often, where someone will put a quote like this on a single post. It gets a lot of attention because it affirms some people's belief. It gets shared everywhere, but there's no citations and there's no follow-up argumentation to it. And then the last point that I think is really interesting is that the definition of natural changes over time and is pretty culturally dependent and discipline specific. When it comes to things like social conventions or a cultural understanding of natural, I think about the idea of same-sex marriage, where it was once considered completely unnatural, and not by everyone, but the general legal consensus is that this is unnatural. It can't happen. Or we might think about the neurodiversity movement, where we're thinking about how there's certain things that are considered unnatural for a period of time or within certain cultures, or neurodivergence is somehow some stark cutoff from neurotypicality. But these things can change over time. And so we can kind of move the definition, expand or contract the definition of natural as societies change, as minds change, as world events unfold. And so it's hard to pin down what natural might actually mean. All right, so to move on to the next fallacy, this one has a very memorable name. This is called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Some fallacies have really memorable names. I think that they're really funny. In part one, we talked about the masked man fallacy, which I think is pretty memorable too. But this one is called Texas sharpshooter. The reason it's called this is because it is based on a metaphor about someone shooting into the side of the barn with a gun. Then, based on where he shot, he then draws a target around the bullet hole, which makes it look like he hit the target. Now, he may also draw the target around a cluster of bullet holes because that might make other people think that, wow, not only did you get one there, but you've got a whole cluster there. You're pretty successful with your gunmanship. But when we zoom out of this very niche metaphor, this fallacy refers to the human tendency to look for similarities, patterns, and to engage in confirmation bias. We're looking for those clusters of whatever bullets refers to in your line of work. And this might ignore or just not even register the impact of chance, or that we might be creating these cognitive circles around certain types of data, rather than taking a look at the whole picture or the whole side of the barn. Now, clinicians, we may ignore, not necessarily actively, we may not even notice the existence of random chance or correlation in the work that we're doing with Gestalt language processors. If something that feels really meaningful happens in a Gestalt session, especially if we really want that event or that utterance or that play moment to have a meaningful cause to it, we might notice that cluster of behavior or cluster of evidence, cluster of utterances, pardon me, and they may stand out as really important because they're clustered together in one session. Now, an example is that, let's say you're in a Facebook group about Gestalt language processing. You may read a post and then see a comment thread. Perhaps the post is a parent asking for advice on what phrases should I naturally model. And then you see quite a few comments underneath with therapists saying they have experiencing modeling phrases that start with let's. And those phrases are working really well for their GLPs. However, I'd want to think about, is this utterance starter of let's, is that the exact cause for successful imitation or acquisition of those phrases? Or are the people posting those comments noticing one pattern and kind of circling it as that active ingredient? Could this be chance rather than cause and effect? Could it be that the way that they're using their voice, the melodic intonation, the rhythm, the volume, the context, are the reason that those utterances are being picked up by that client, rather than the starter of let's itself? Now, it may be easier to notice the impact of that let's because it's at the beginning of an utterance. A lot of GLP-focused clinicians use it, and so they're going to use it more often, maybe than other starters. But they may not be noticing the other types of starters to their models that may also be working. And so it's just this thing about, is this truly cause and effect of success? Or could this be up to chance or other factors, but we're just circling part of the data that seems to be working? Now, patterns are really important. Patterns are extremely useful in our work, and they're also extremely useful for creating hypotheses, which we really need in our field to continue our success and efficiency. The patterns that we see at the clinical level, they're an excellent starting point to be able to kick off, inspire more formal empirical research. Because I can speak from opinion, I have really wonderful sessions working with GLPs with great feedback, great clinical experiences of success, but also I'm very interested in knowing what are the actual active ingredients when I'm able to pull away bias and pull away any fallacies I'm engaging in. If I can get down to the true active ingredients of a session, I may be more efficient as a clinician. We may need less sessions. We may realize that my sessions aren't actually helping at all because that child needs different supports for them. But without knowing what the active ingredients are through testing a hypothesis, I may not know correlation from causation, and I'm probably going to be engaging in confirmation bias because I am a fallible human. Now, what is also important to know is that if you form a hypothesis based on the sharpshooter fallacy, if you see this cluster of data points that feel really exciting or meaningful and drawing the circle around them, forming a hypothesis based on that cluster is not fallacious at all. In fact, that's a pretty motivating place to start. If you see this cluster of information, for example, if I notice that so many of my clients are referencing Bluey quotes, I see this cluster of information, I could engage in Texas sharpshooter and think, okay, Bluey is the only thing I'm going to model from because that's where the cluster is. For me, that would be a fallacious argument because I may not be taking into account that the most motivating show for one client might be Paw Patrol, or the most motivating YouTube channel for another client where she derives the most gestalts is Gracie's Corner. But because of this cluster, I'm thinking I need to memorize all of Bluey. However, that could be the point of a hypothesis of trying to figure out, are Bluey quotes actually the ones that are required most? Or I know for my area of research, are there any melodic lines or rhythmic properties that may be leading to this type of acquisition of new gestalts from the show? So clusters are a great place to start, but they shouldn't be the end of the conversation. Now, another example, kind of when we think about people who are not really on board with GLP or NLA, might call them detractors. I know in the online world, people will call them naysayers. So people might see that there's this cluster of SLPs online who have a lot of enthusiasm for NLA, and then they make the assumption or they claim that it's a fad. But if they're only seeing that cluster and not thinking about how, or maybe not paying attention to, or even seeking out a bigger data set about all the SLPs who don't ascribe to that idea, all the SLPs who feel ambivalent about the framework, and also all the SLPs who are not online, who are not chronically on Instagram. And so, is the cluster that they are witnessing, who are really excited about GLP and NLA, just something they're painting that circle around to make the claim that it is a fad, rather than taking into account a much wider data set of speech language pathologists. Okay, let's move on to the next one. This next one is called the burden of proof fallacy. Now, this fallacy is when someone makes a claim that needs justification, but when they're challenged on their claim, they demand that the opposition is actually responsible for proving them wrong. So let's say I make a claim that singing to Gestalt language processors is the most effective way to model language. And then someone might ask me, perhaps in a comment, can you give me evidence for why singing is the most effective way to model language? If I then respond and say, you need to, that's like on you. You need to go figure out, you need to prove me wrong. I know I'm right. I know this is real. It's up to you to prove me wrong. And I've seen that before in almost those exact words. So it's this idea of asking the person who is questioning or showing curiosity to prove you wrong. But when we think about the legal world, the philosophical world, when it comes to the culture of debate, the burden of proof is typically on the person who is making that claim, especially if that claim has fallacies or bias in it, or is something that is relatively new that the field is considering. So here's an example. A speech therapist on a Facebook group is claiming that naturally modeling language is the best intervention for GLPs. This is a claim that I think requires more justification. I want to know why. Can you share evidence? Can you give information about the brain or clinical patterns? I want to know more. Now, someone else, let's say I go into the comments and I would like to ask for justification. Now, I might be coming from a place of curiosity. Now, someone else might be coming in as a strong detractor or naysayer. So the tone can be pretty different, but I'm asking for justification. The original poster may deflect that request and say, it's up to you to prove that wrong. I know what I'm doing. This is working for my clients. And so you can figure that out on your own. You can go do the research yourself. And what that is that the person who's making the claim, who's stepping out and making their ideas known, they're choosing not to take on the burden and do that work. And perhaps by not actually engaging in that dialogue, that original SLP is going to presume that they're right. They're going to continue to share that claim, regardless of whether it's actually backed up by evidence or not. Now, another example, kind of on the quote other side, let's say there's a researcher on Instagram who claims that echolalia is not a meaningful component or part of language development because it's a repetitive and restricted behavior. So it's not meaningful. Then a speech therapist writes a comment and they ask for more evidence for this claim. They ask for better evidence that give me evidence that echolalia is not actually meaningful in language acquisition. Can you go beyond the argument that it's a restricted and repetitive behavior? And so it could be asking to expand upon that argument, go a little bit deeper, and ask for a little bit more logic and evidence behind that. Then let's imagine that the researcher comes back and comments, by encouraging the SLP to, quote, do your own research about echolalia because there's plenty out there. So they're shifting the burden of proof back to the person who is expressing curiosity or perhaps animosity, and shifting that back over when that researcher was the one to put their idea out there for people to consume. So that's the burden of proof. This one absolutely cracks me up. This one is called the fallacy.
There's other names for it that are a little less goofy, but I love this one. I think it's very memorable for the name. And I think this one is so, so, so important when we're thinking about the consumption of Gestalt language processing information, when we're considering the natural language acquisition framework, works about echolalia, language sampling, language processing, everything that people who are working with GLPs and have really benefited from these frameworks. I think this one's very important. The fallacy that'll never not crack me up is when someone assumes that an argument that has a logical fallacy in it must be false. So let me say that again a little differently. So if there is an argument someone makes online, but it includes a logical fallacy, then you're saying that's false. It has a logical fallacy. It's not true. That's actually a fallacy because the original claim might actually be true. It's just that their argument was not great for it. Let me give you an example. I'm going to give you examples for all of these because I know I learn best through examples, analogies, stories. It helps me remember things. Let's say that a speech language pathologist makes a claim that natural language acquisition is the best approach for Gestalt language processors because it is natural. Like we talked about previously, that would be the fallacy of appeal to nature. Just saying that just because something is natural, it makes it good or true or correct. And like we mentioned, how do we even define natural? So that claim that an SLP made, it's got a logical fallacy in it. However, that fallacy existing, the inclusion of the appeal to nature fallacy, doesn't necessarily make that original claim false. Natural language acquisition may be the best approach for Gestalt language processors. It may be true, but that claim really should not rest upon a fallacious argument to prove it as correct. We can't throw the whole thing away just because there's a fallacy involved. It's just that the burden of proof, you can see how these all kind of fit together. The burden of proof is back on the person who made the claim to clarify their argument, to make it stronger, to try not to include a fallacy in it. Can we move away from this idea of it's natural? And can people making claims about NLA attach it to perhaps research from neuroscience, research from linguistics, psycholinguistics, from really strong clinical studies that show that this is the best approach without or with reduced fallacy within it, but it doesn't make it completely untrue. And I do tend to see that where, because there's a certain weakness in an argument about Gestalt processing, the whole thing is thrown away. Here is another fallacy. And this is actually pulling from one of the fallacies in part 1. This one is called affirming the consequent. And if you're interested in learning about that, listen to the episode about part 1 of logical fallacies. So I pulled this one in because I think there's a fun connection between these. So let's say there's a speech language pathologist who makes the claim. They say, if my client is a Gestalt language processor, then they produce echolalia. My client produces echolalia, or no, let me change that. My other client produces echolalia. Therefore, that other client is a Gestalt language processor. So I'm going to read that again so I can say it a bit smoother without that error. If my client is a Gestalt language processor, then they produce echolalia. My other client produces echolalia. Therefore, that client is also a Gestalt language processor. So this claim has the affirming the consequent fallacy. Let me explain why. So this is making the claim that Gestalt language processors produce echolalia, which a lot of, when we point to the framework of Gestalt language processing would be true. But this claim goes on that a client who produces echolalia is inherently a GLP. But that isn't necessarily true. The first part may be, but the second part is not strong because echolalia also exists in other populations. We see echolalia in Tourette's. We see echolalia in obsessive compulsive disorder. We see echolalia in ADHD. And as someone with ADHD, I engage in echolalia every single day. But I also do not identify as a Gestalt language processor. I process the world building block by building block, and then I create a whole building out of it. I still engage in and love communicating through echolalia. So that claim by the SLP has an affirming the consequent fallacy within it, but it doesn't mean that the claim isn't true. That would be the fallacy. Because the current conception of Gestalt language processing does claim and state echolalia as a key component. So I want to take a pause here because I'd love for you as a listener to start thinking about the fallacies we've already talked about. As a review, we've talked about the appeal to nature, which is that something that is natural is good, correct, or true. Something that is unnatural is bad, correct, or false. We've talked about Texas sharpshooter, which is kind of painting that circle of proof around a cluster of data points rather than taking into account the wider data set and perhaps thinking that a pattern is meaningful because things are clustered together and you've decided to circle it in your brain. We've talked about the burden of proof, where someone who makes a claim is then pushing that burden to the person questioning it or wanting to know more or pushing against the validity or the strength of the claim. And then we just talked about the fallacy, which is that just because something has a fallacious argument doesn't mean that the first part is not true. So I want you to take a moment and think about your own relationship with social media. And if you're not on social media, I commend you. I bet your brain is a lot less chaotic than mine is, as someone who is chronically painfully online. But I want you to start thinking about, can you think back to any posts you've seen, comments you've seen, posts you've made, comments you've made, or perhaps even the ways you've explained your clinical rationale to parents, to teachers, to colleagues? Can you think about if any of these fallacies have come up? It might be worth considering, especially if you're producing content on social media. I challenge you to take a look back at something. Does it include any fallacies in it? And that doesn't mean that you made a bad, wrong, or terrible post or comment. It means that you're a human and it's got fallacy in it. And it can be an inspiring way to think about the way that you construct arguments in the future. Now, if you're thinking about any instances of this and they come to mind, I would love to hear about them. Whether that it's in the chat, in the live webinar, in the comments, in the podcast episode, definitely tell me about the fallacies that you notice in your own language or in the content you consume. But I want to make sure that you have one more to take with you. And I think this one is very interesting. This is called the historian's fallacy. So the historian's fallacy exists in claims where there's an assumption that people in history, former decision makers, medical professionals, pioneer researchers, it's the assumption that they had identical information to inform their decisions, identical information to the information that we have now, to the perspective we have on now about something. The historian's fallacy is also those that were pioneers in something were making really strong decisions. They were making really strong claims because they were some of the first. So we may see these in claims, presentations, arguments that go back to original explanations of concepts when it comes to autism and echolalia or language or behavior. They go back to some of the original definitions, the original methods, the original rationales.
maybe pioneers like Leo Kanner or Lavos. And people might make claims about current clinical decisions, for example, about how to characterize autism or how to treat certain things that were considered pathologies then, and make modern day today decisions about plans of care and education that are based on those pioneers. Now, there is nothing wrong with referencing the former decision makers, because it's really important to know where our fields came from, to understand where the information started. But it's also really important to know what has been built on top of that, especially if practices we've found them to be harmful or to change, especially now that we have so much technology to look inside the brain and look inside the body in new ways. We now have decades of clinical and neuroscience research that can help us create treatment approaches that might be better suited to these emerging understanding of the autistic neurotype and the nervous system, the growing information that down to the neuron, down to the synapse, the autistic brain is different, that the oscillations, the excitation and the inhibition relationships at the synapse level is less organized. The fact that the auditory brainstem may have overrepresented phonological categories that might impede language processing on its way up to the auditory cortices. These are not things that would have been known or studied at the original conceptualization of autism, but we know now and can help us update our clinical decisions. Now, when we think about the perspective from language acquisition, researchers that the natural language acquisition approach reference often are researchers like Ann Peters, researchers like Laura Lee, and I love their works. When I read the works and the studies of Peters and Lee, it really changed the way I thought about child language acquisition. And they engaged in really interesting analyses at the time that they studied and they wrote them. And also, if we leave ourselves there at that point of inquiry, we're also leaving out the decades that have followed and not necessarily integrating their ideas of that time with the more modern findings, which is giving us a wider sample pool of how language is acquired. And the emphasis in more recent years on getting language samples that aren't middle-class white families who are able to take time to go into a clinic or take 3 to 5 years to track their child's language acquisition. We might be looking more at populations who are less represented, who aren't able to access a clinical setting or even know about it. Now we're able to analyze the language of children who maybe historically weren't getting autism diagnoses. And also, we're able to assess language acquisition and language processing with technology like fMRI and EEG. And so instead of continuing to go back to claims and arguments from the 70s, 80s, or beforehand, can we be integrating the new information with some of the seminal research so that we're not accidentally engaging in the historian's fallacy? The original works are so important to understanding where we are now. They set the stage, but now we can bring different things onto that stage and make sure the stage is sturdy enough to stand on. We don't want to assume that the work of Kanner and Lavos or Lee or Peters or any of them would have the same conclusions if they did it today. If they were using the technology we have today, or they were aware of the neurodiversity movement or listening to autistic adults and adults who are GLPs, would they even make the same conclusions in their work? And we also want to think about, are we basing our decisions on a restricted period of clinical and scientific inquiry, especially if we're restricting that time period because it supports the claims we're trying to make? I'm thinking about how can the work of these pioneers grow and transform through our processes of clinical and academic science. Those who came before us, there's so much value there. And also, it's our turn.
what can we do now to grow upon that? So those are the 5 fallacies I wanted to share with you in this episode. There were several others in part 1 that I recommend learning about. Those are some of the more common ones. But you might be asking yourself, great, these are the fallacies. What do I do? If I encounter something that feels like a weak argument, that feels like it's missing something, that feels, I've just got this feeling in my stomach that something's off. And there's a lot to be said about what are gut feelings, gut reactions, are they real? But if you've just got that feeling when you read something that this just isn't hitting the mark, there's no citations, is this appealing to my feelings, my values? Does this have some sort of like ad hominem attack on someone? It might be worth asking the following questions. So I have a list of 8 questions that you might want to consider asking 1 or 2 of them when you come across a social media claim about Gestalt language processing, natural language acquisition, verbal behavior, ABA, and how they deal with language, any of those. You might want to ask one of these 8 questions. And I find that the more you practice asking these questions or referring to them, the more easily they'll come up as you're reading things. You might instantly think of a fallacy and then instantly think of the question that will help you understand what you're reading and whether you want to add it to your knowledge set or not. So let's go through these questions. Now, if these questions remind you of a claim that you've read or seen, and you might even want to consider opening up a Facebook group or an Instagram post or your homepage and seeing if you can pause or while you scroll through, see if you can find one while you're listening to this episode. And I'd love to hear if one comes up for you, if you're listening live, put it in the chat. Or if you're listening to our recording or on a podcast platform, feel free to comment what you notice in the comment section. So, questions to ask about a claim or argument. Number 1, does this claim about Gestalt language processing or anti-GLP use irrelevant evidence in its argument? It doesn't make the evidence false, but is it irrelevant to the argument? So here's an example that might have irrelevant evidence. Autistic brains show absent or right-sided laterality for language. So we should only be using play-based activities to work on language with GLPs. So the evidence for using play-based activities is that autistic brains don't necessarily have left-sided laterality for language. But as a reader of this, so when I read this, I'm thinking, yeah, play-based activities, definitely. I love play-based therapy. But what's the connection to absent or right-sided laterality for language? There's missing pieces here. I don't see how that connects to play-based activities. The first part of it, I mean, the evidence there, that sounds really smart. I might read that and be like, oh, wow, the person posting this knows that's so interesting. They know this about the autistic brain. Okay, I guess that makes sense if it's a different part. Okay, cool. And if I'm not really thinking about it, I might say, okay, that makes sense, and maybe start to tell other people about it. But there's a disconnect there. Why would language, more so living on the right side of the brain, make us want to do play-based activities to help them? There's missing pieces there. It's just something to think about. And just because someone's using interesting vocabulary or saying something that, you know, if one part of it teaches you something new, it doesn't make the entire thing true. And even if both sides of it are true, there's not a connection point between them. Here is another one that might have irrelevant evidence in the argument. Someone might say, echolalia has been described as a pathological characteristic for decades. Therefore, it should not be considered language. That may also play to the historian's fallacy. But that's kind of irrelevant. Sure, okay, echolalia has been described as pathological for a long time. Sure, yeah, it has been for decades. Therefore, echolalia should not be considered language. There's a disconnect there. Just because something has been described a certain way for a long time doesn't mean that we should consider to do it now or not consider it language. There may also be, if we think about what could be considered pathology, maybe in Tourette's, is the unexpected or uncontrollable utterances that perhaps have expletives in them. That might be considered pathology when it comes to Tourette's, or echolalia that happens for someone with Tourette's. But is that not considered language? Because expletives are certainly a feature of language. So there's some irrelevance there in the argument they're making that it existing as a pathological characteristic for a long time means that it's not language. There's just missing pieces there. But it's playing to the historical fallacy. It's playing to this idea that the pioneers or the majority of research claims that must make it true today. But I just see weaknesses there. Number two, you might want to ask, does the claim I'm reading about GLP or anti-GLP, and that is in the biggest quotes ever, does this claim use unsupported, misleading, or illogical reasoning in its argument? So the first one is a pretty relevant one for the time that I'm recording this episode. There's kind of a tizzy happening based on a recent presentation at the ASHA conference about GLP. So I wanted to draw from that, but I'm going to put it in my own words. So someone might say something to the tune of, and it's not just at this presentation, I see things to the tune of this all the time. Something like, traditional AAC, like PECS, the Picture Exchange Communication System, traditional AAC like PECS is easier for communication partners, and therefore it is better for working on language than suboptimal communication forms like echolalia. So let's slow that down. Traditional AAC like PECS, and traditional, we could also argue how are you operationalizing that, is easier for communication partners. Okay, so that lives on its own. It's easier for communication partners. I'd want evidence of that. I'm thinking my lived experience of that, and I am just one clinician. PECS was one of the hardest things I ever tried to do when I was a young clinician. One of the hardest. It drove me nuts. And a lot of the parents I worked with, like, I don't want to do this at home. It's a lot of work in my personal clinical experience. This is the claim that PECS is easier for communication partners. Fine. Let's say that stands on its own. But is there logic connected to the next part? And therefore, PECS would be better for working on language rather than suboptimal communication like echolalia. So let's try and connect these two sides. Traditional AAC is easier for communication partners. Okay, so great. It's easier for parents, teachers, therapists. So it's better for working on language than echolalia. But what does better mean? Does it mean it leads to better outcomes? Better outcomes than working on echolalia? But is echolalia even AAC? There's missing pieces here. It's misleading because we're talking about ease for communication partners, but are we also talking about whether the clients are making progress? Or are we just talking about it being easier for some people while potentially being harder for the actual client? There's just there's murkiness here, and I'm not seeing the logical connection between it being easy for someone and it being better for language. Okay, the next one, we might encounter something to the tune of, at stage 3,
GLPs make a brain switch to the left hemisphere for language. This feels very exciting to read. Oh my gosh, if we can get to stage 3, there's a brain switch to the left hemisphere where language just goes there or lights up there, it happens, or the corpus callosum right across. Okay, so at stage, let's slow down. I think that's the thing that's helped me most when I am encountering information or claims in social media, because I am scrolling so fast. I'm looking for my dopamine hits. So at stage 3, which if you're looking at natural language acquisition, there's stages 1 through 6. Stage 3 is when we isolate down to single units. So like a noun or preposition, an adjective. That's when it comes down to the smallest building blocks, according to NLA. But at stage 3, they're claiming that GLPs make a brain switch to that left hemisphere for language. And that sounds really cool. It sounds very exciting, especially we look above, okay, autistic brains may have absent laterality or right-sided laterality for language. So maybe that means that my treatment, which got them to stage 3, is helping the left side for language get stronger or light up. What a profound impact I must be having. This is where, if I didn't, consider logic fallacy, if I read this maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I would have been so excited. I can't wait to get to stage 3, because then the left side of the brain is gonna turn on. Oh my gosh, this is so exciting. But is that claim supported? Is there evidence for that? Is there logic behind that? How would we even know that if we haven't done brain studies to see, is the oxygenation different in the left hemisphere? Is blood flow different? Are the oscillatory patterns in the language areas, in Broca's and Wernicke's, have those changed or come online in a new way? This is an exciting, interesting claim. But if we haven't done empirical research to actually look at the hemispheres functioning, how could we even make that claim? It sounds cool. It sounds nice. And also, have we looked and done the deep study needed to look into the hemisphere itself? And I think that unsupported kind of claim, that's where I tend to get nervous or frustrated. And now I'm speaking to my own feelings and perspective. And so I want to make that clear. This is my clinical positioning as a single practitioner. That's where I get nervous and frustrated, because it feels as if there is this divide or this black and white between, I believe in GLP, GLP is real, that's it. And then there is GLP is a fad, GLP is a cult, not real. And there's these two vocal sides. And what is interesting is that, and I characterize myself as this, several of my colleagues, when we're in conversation about this whole ecosystem, we consider ourselves in the middle, where, for me, my entire practice is Gestalt language processors. This is what I want to do my dissertation on. And also, I feel very uncomfortable making big claims about hemispheres and language networks without actually looking to see what's happening in those areas of the brain. It's not because I don't think that GLP has legs to it. I do it every day. Now, how many biases are at play? I don't know. But I just don't think that there's anything wrong with wanting to know more and get deeper evidence. In fact, the pushback to that is really concerning to me. Why wouldn't we want to know more about this thing that we're passionate about? But I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but that's the idea of like unsupported reasoning. I'd want to look for more support before I make a big claim like that. Question 3, we might want to ask, does the person making the claim represent themselves as an expert on something, even if they may not have expertise in the area of that claim? Here's an example. A BCBA is arguing that using intoned language, like very prosodic, here we go, outside, that would be highly intoned language techniques. So a BCBA is arguing against using intoned language for a child, but they don't have expertise in the science of language development, in the neuroscience connected to highly intoned language and prosody. That's something where I'd want to pause and say, what's the evidence behind that? How do you know that using intoned language techniques wouldn't be helpful? How do you know, or what's your argument behind using like regular spoken language, not really intoned language, being better or having better outcomes, if this is not an area that you've studied? So I'd want to know more about that. And maybe they have studied it extensively. I know that there are BCBAs who are also SLPs. I know there are BCBAs who love research about musical neuroscience. And so that might be my fallacy, that I'm making assumptions. But is the person making a claim actually have expertise in what they're making a claim about? Then perhaps this is a claim that someone's making. Something like, and this pulls from a very popular quote that goes around the internet every couple months or couple years, but this idea of science tells us it only takes a couple of repetitions when a kid is playing to create a new neuron. That sounds really cool. So we're repeating a word a couple times when we're playing. That's going to make a new neuron after just a couple times, rather than if we're just teaching it over and over again. Oh my gosh, that's so cool. If I'm playing with a kid, we're going to make a new neuron. It's an exciting idea, but also, do you have expertise in neuroscience? And can you explain what type of synapse is forming? What part of the brain are you referring to? What kind of play is it that works for that word or phrase repetition? How many neurons are naturally forming at any given moment? Because in childhood, it's a lot. And versus the alleged new neuron. So if neurons are forming rapidly in childhood all the time, what's different about this new neuron? There's so many more questions there that I want to know answers to, and kind of pulling it apart from this really exciting claim about how play can be so much more powerful for language acquisition than perhaps teaching. And that is something that, I am a play-based therapist. I witnessed this to be helpful. I've read a lot of research about how play is supportive of language acquisition. But also when I read a claim like this, there's a lot of missing pieces there. It sounds really cool that we form a new neuron, but also neurons are forming all the time. So there's weakness there. The fourth question I might want to ask is, does this claim make an ad hominem attack, make fun of someone, a person or a group that disagrees with, or is it engaging in implicit bias about the group or the person making the claim? So this is kind of like the playing dirty claims, or the ones that engage in bias and implicit bias. We all have them, and they're not very helpful for strong decision-making or ethical decision-making. So yeah, this is kind of like the playing dirty or engaging in biases that are, they're not so great. So here's one I see often. Claiming that all ABA therapists are abusive. Claiming that all ABA is abuse. That's a really, really big claim. And it also engages in implicit bias, because it's making an assumption about every RBT, every BCBA, and I believe there's one BCAB. There's another one I can't think of. That is a broad brush claim about a lot of people because of implicit bias about this entire field. Now, I have a lot of discomfort personally with ABA, at least how it exists when
engaging with the autistic population. Now that's based on reports from autistic adults, that's based on weaknesses and fallacies in some of the seminal research I've read, that has resulted in such strong recommendations for ABA based on my time working in centers, based on the whole private equity system behind it. There's a lot of concern I have about this field, but to make such a big claim about every single person engaging in this field, including the ones who specialize now in working with Gestalt processors, that's engaging in a lot of implicit bias and, in my opinion, a pretty unfair attack on a lot of people. Another thing you might see is perhaps at a highly attended national convention presentation, putting up quotes from someone who posts on Instagram about GLP and laughing about them. That would be a claim someone's making and using that screenshot or that quote to make fun of them, group that they disagree with. And perhaps claiming that NLA, GLP is a cult. That's one I've heard as well, even from, I heard it from one pretty respected researcher. They called it the Gestalt cult. And that's kind of, you know, it's poking fun, it's using kind of a cutesy word, and the word cult is, you know, it's a strong term. And there are interesting, you know, patterns of language and interaction in the GLP community that do overlap with some linguistic choices that are seen in control groups, but we can also see these anywhere. Or something like saying that academic SLPs just don't get it. They'll never understand what impact this is having in real people's lives. And that would also be a moment of implicit bias, saying that academic SLPs, they are so far removed from the real world, and I'm seeing all the proof I need before my eyes. When there may be a lot of academic SLPs who are really interested in knowing more about this and have good faith interest and may have institutional barriers to being able to do the research that the clinical SLPs really want. And as someone who's going to be going into academia in the coming year, who will be an emerging researcher who wants to know everything I can and study everything I can about this, that might be hard to hear that, because I've lived the clinical experience with GLPs, but I'm going to have different barriers around how I can stay involved. And I hope that I still get it. And I hope that I can still have a foot in the world, but that is a big, broad brush to paint. All right, questions 5 and 6 I might want to consider asking. Number 5, and this harkens back to part 1 where we talked about appeal to emotion, which I think is one of the most important ones, because working with kids, working with autistic kids, and working with families, especially families who just got diagnoses, who are stressed and confused, emotions are a big part of it. And pulling out emotions from an emotional field can be difficult. So appeal to emotion is one I'd love for you to have on your radar. But number 5, ask yourself, does this claim someone's making center an emotional appeal to me? Does it center my values as a person rather than evidence for a language intervention? So is this appealing to my emotions? Perhaps my desire to be a good clinician, my desire to, you know, be really successful, my desire to help, my insecurities, I have imposter syndrome, I want to feel better. Does this center my values of being play-based, of being neurodiversity affirming? I want to be those things. But does the claim someone's making actually have evidence, or is it using buzzwords or language techniques that kind of appeal more to who I am without a lot of strong evidence? And that is an emotional creature who really wants to stick to my values. So here is something that might center an emotional appeal. Maybe making an argument that certain techniques are a way to honor an autistic child for exactly who they are. That taps into my emotions immediately. Even reading that, I wrote that and it taps into my emotions reading it. It taps into my values that I want to respect human beings and children for exactly who they are. But is that appealing to just my emotions and my values? Or is it an argument that's supporting clinical choices that I really want to, have it rooted in evidence? Now, my values, my emotion, and the evidence can all line up. I would love for that to happen. I'm trying to practice in that intersection every day. But what if the evidence is actually incongruent with the emotional appeal and the values? That's something I'd really want to know as a clinician so that I'm not engaging in low quality, null, or even negative application of techniques, even if it targets my feelings and the values I have as a clinician. I want to know. The sixth question I might want to ask: does the claim someone's making oversimplify really complex phenomena? And there's a lot of claims that do. Think about the neuron example. Think about the hemisphere switch example. That is oversimplifying really complex things. We barely know anything about the brain. We got a lot of disciplines looking at the brain. It is a complex place. But is this claim making an oversimplification, especially into either or polarized choices or views? And I spoke to this a little bit before, that there is pro-GLP and anti-GLP. And all of us in the middle we're like, people are trying to pull us to both sides, but it's just not that simple. So much of what we look at in these ecosystems, it's a continuum. And these polarized choices, they tend to divide us. They tend to make it more difficult to engage in dialogue. They leave parents and families feeling really confused and worried because it's either or in the way that it's marketed, talked about, especially on social media. So here are some either or that I've seen emerge, especially in social media. One side might say GLP is a fad. GLP isn't real. GLP is a cult. And those are oversimplifying complex phenomena and emerging complex frameworks into either or. It's just a fad. It isn't real. And then maybe and I'm always saying this with like a bit of a smile and quotes, like pro-GLP people might say that there is a binary between analytic language processors and Gestalt language processors as this binary. And there are ideas about like dual language processing too, so 2 or 3 categories. They're creating this binary between real versus unreal. And also, like, philosophers debate reality all the time. So who are we even to define real versus not real? Perhaps this polarization between fad versus something that could become a new standard. Standards have to start somewhere. Or this binary between analytic and Gestalt. So think about, is this an oversimplification? Simplified information makes our brains really, 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 really happy. But when it comes to the human brain and body and the nature of reality and moving forward science to new standards and updated standards, these are complex phenomena. And so oversimplification is really good at helping us feel better, persuade us, sell us something, create in-group and out-group. So keep an eye out for it. All right, and the last 2 questions I would love for you to just think about. Number 7, does the claim someone's making exclude or dismiss any relevance of perhaps null effects for clients or negative effects for clients for whom these techniques don't work? So are there kids and families out there for whom strategies recommended for GLPs aren't working? Are there kids for whom they're actually having a negative impact? Are those kids being talked about? Are those stories being presented? Is there data about that? I think that's important to know. All right, back to my personal experience. I don't often see those stories. I don't often see those centered or talked about in big accounts or stories and posts that rip around, especially Instagram. So we want to think about who might be missing from this. Which stories, which patterns, which clusters are not being painted around as a target. Okay, so for example, perhaps a therapist who is in complete opposition to NLA, they have clients who are responding really well when that clinician sings or uses melodic input. But they're not going to, they might not pay attention to that cluster of data. They might exclude that or justify it in a different way because those might be considered NLA techniques, but they might not want to consider that because it's not relevant to them. Or on the other side, there might be a clinician who calls themselves a GLP clinician, an NLA clinician. They might explain away or ignore, and might not be intentional at all, null data where doesn't seem to be an impact, or even like negative effects of techniques. If those are happening, we might ignore them, explain them away if they're not responding to that treatment because it'll happen eventually. We just have to keep modeling. But if we're excluding that information or dismissing it and engaging in confirmation bias, how is that moving this cause forward? How is that moving, the desire for evidence forward? It might even be excluding really important evidence. Number 8, I'd love for you to ask yourself, does the claim being expressed, does it seem to speak to absolute certainty about an idea? Is that person sounding really, really sure about it? Are they using words like a GLP will, a GLP is, a GLP does? Those are pretty certain. Or are they using modals like a GLP might, a GLP could, a GLP may? Those give room for some flexibility, and they allow for degrees of probability rather than certainty. Is this a claim where probability or a continuum might be more appropriate? I look back at a lot of my earliest posts on Instagram. I spoke with so much certainty. GLPs are, GLPs will, you should, I was so sure. But I didn't have a lot of evidence behind it. I had my clinical experience. I had the collective in-group set of stories. But the certainty I spoke with was something I really needed to think about and shift, because I don't have the full body of evidence. I mean, no one ever will. I don't have the level of evidence I actually need from a neural perspective, from the neuroscience perspective, to speak about psychoacoustics and music theory the way that I was. I need more evidence to be able to make claims with verbs like that. So now I stick to may, could, might, can. So we might see absolute certainty in a claim that there are 6 stages of language development for GLPs. And it's talked about as if it's certain. My client is stage 4. It feels very certain. But we need more information about what these stages really are. And what about kids who might not fall into these stages? That speaks to question 7. Are we truly certain about these stages? Or is there more of this continuum or degrees of probability? Who falls outside of those clusters that seem to follow this path? And this is coming from someone who references the stages every single day. I want to know more. Let's look at this more deeply. Another one with absolute certainty is I heard people say, this whole GLP thing is a cult. It can't be real. And they say it with such certainty. We might want to think about, there might be elements that feel related to certain cult language, cult tactics, because we see that in a lot of groups, that there's certain linguistic choices that help create cohesion. So there may be elements of that, but saying with certainty that it's a cult, and we also know that cults tend to be associated with really intense physical behavior or like behavioral control. That's a whole different story. But to say it with such certainty or that it can't be real, that's not allowing for different, for gray areas or for continua or for degrees of probability in there. It's a very certain thing to say, which speaks back to creating divisions. So these are the 8 questions that I find to be helpful for myself when I get that feeling, when I read something that might feel too good to be true, might feel really compelling or taps into my emotion. It feels really good to read, or it confirms my existing beliefs, or if it makes me really, really angry. If I read something that I just vehemently disagree with, no, I disagree. But I want to figure out, am I engaging a logical fallacy? Or is a logical fallacy in that post that's making me angry? Is that the reason I'm angry? So these are 8 questions to think about. But I created a tool for myself, a visual tool that helps me slow myself down, especially when it comes to social media, where dopamine's high, speed is fast. And this is a chart. It has 6 columns, and this is a way I slow down my thinking and try and better understand the fallacies that might be at play. In the first column, and this is a simple chart, you can use a piece of paper, just scratch it down. And I put this really in my notes app on my phone. The first one is I write down, what is the claim that this person's making? What's the assertion they're making? What's their idea? So I write that down word for word. Then I write down, what are my gut reactions? What feelings come up? What are the first thoughts that arise? And that might not feel very scientific, but it can really help to write them down and kind of isolate them so that they're not swimming in the rest of the columns. Get those down. Now that frees me up to ask more questions. Which of those 8 questions do I want to ask myself? I recommend if you're getting started, just ask one, see what happens. Then once I ask that question, I want to see if I can identify a fallacy within it. Oh, wow. They made a claim that is from 1943, back to Leo Connor. That might be the historian's fallacy. Maybe that's why I'm feeling really angry about that claim. Once you can talk about the fallacy, I find for me that once I can name the fallacy, my emotions, my feelings, they're a lot less reactive and defensive. And I can get pretty quick to being defensive. But what's interesting is the more I've learned about and tried to apply this fallacy work, I'm much less defensive when it comes to reading these things. So after I identify the fallacy and ask these questions, I check back in. What are my feelings now? Now, what are my thoughts about this claim? That then positions me for the last column, which is next steps. Based on the fallacy in this claim, what do I need to learn next? What do I need to ask that person? Or what do I need to change about my language or my clinical choices? I might read something about laterality of the hemisphere and feel really excited about it, then ask a question about, is this an oversimplification? Realize that there's a fallacy there. And then I feel a bit more thoughtful and curious. And then I figure out my next step is I want to go read about hemispheric lateralization. And now I feel spurred into action rather than emotion. And I'm using the claim as a jumping off point rather than as a certain truth. So those are the steps I go through when I'm thinking about a fallacy. And like I've mentioned, the more I've practiced this, the more automatic it becomes. Very often, I don't even have to use the columns anymore. I can go through those 6 steps in my brain, and it helps me make a more informed decision about how I'm consuming information about Gestalt language processing, natural language acquisition, verbal behavior, and everything related to it when it comes to social media discourse. Thank you so much for tuning in for this live recording of the episode. I do want to open up the opportunity for anyone who has questions. We have time for 1 or 2, and then I will read you out for what you need to do to get credit for coming to this live webinar, because you deserve credit for showing up tonight. Thank you for kind words in the chat. I appreciate it. Oh, and I do also want to say, well, if anyone's deciding to put any questions in the chat, if you are interested in following along, I do have a series on logical fallacies. They are, unfortunately, in very cute Instagram posts. But if you're interested and want to learn more or stay connected, I love chatting. I'm going to put my Instagram account in the chat. Please feel free to reach out. I'm extremely passionate about this area of speech language pathology and, the wider world of language and autism. And I'd love to talk more, especially if you're interested in how music can intersect and musical information, psychoacoustics can support auditory processing. Please reach out. Yeah, thank you for all the kind words. I appreciate it. Oh, and if there are any logical fallacies in what I say, definitely reach out. I'd love to know. Lori says, can apply in everyday life. Yes, these are everywhere. So I'm going to read us out with the final information from Speech Therapy PD. And thank you so much, Speech Therapy PD, for hosting this podcast and making this possible. Oh, I see one more question. What specific area of research will you be exploring? I haven't quite decided yet. I have a lot of hypotheses I want to look into. I might want to look into the impact of syncopation in language modeling for making spoken input more predictable for the autistic neurotype. I'm also interested in pitch glides. I'm also interested qualitatively in the experiences and the online discourse around Gestalt processing, making sense of what we're seeing in the online world. But I am meeting with a potential advisor on Thursday to talk about what we might want to do. So stay tuned. Very excited. Okay, thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you again another Speech Therapy PD course and another episode of the Gestalt Get Together.
Thanks so much for joining us on today's podcast. Remember to go to speechtherapypd.com to learn more about earning ASHA CEUs. We want you to get credit for the hard work you've put in to further your education. We also appreciate your support. We'd love for you to write a quick review of the podcast and subscribe. If you're listening on a streaming platform, feel free to rate us. 5 stars is great, 4 stars is awesome, but we also appreciate honesty around here if it's lower. That way, your ratings and your reviews will help get our podcast to more clinicians like you, as well as parents and people from other professions who might benefit from learning about Gestalt language processing. Now, if you've indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete address in your account profile prior to the course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA for you. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to be reflected on your ASHA transcript. And also, please don't hesitate to tell us which topics you would like us to cover in future episodes. To get in touch, drop us a line in the comments section or send us a message on social media. We'd love to hear who you want us to interview, what topics are on your mind, and where you'd like us to investigate when it comes to the world of GLP. Okay, but here's the really cool part, especially because you listened all the way to the end. For our Gestalt Get Together listeners, we actually have a special coupon code to receive $20 off any annual subscription to speechtherapypd.com. Head over there to get ASHA CEUs for listening to this podcast and all other episodes. My code is Gestalt20. You're going to put Gestalt in all caps, and that is GESTALT 20. I hope to see you at our next episode.